Ever wondered about a person who managed to break free from prison walls not just once or twice, but an astounding 4 times? Hi, I'm Julia, and today I'm sharing an incredible story of Yoshie Shiratori, an individual whose resilience and ingenuity challenged all expectations. His journey will captivate and motivate you. Aomori, Japan, 1936. Yoshie Shiratori sat in a dark, freezing cell. His body ached from beatings, and his wrists were red from handcuffs. He was not guilty of any crime. Yet, he had been forced to confess to murder. The guards laughed at his pain. Worse, prosecutors wanted him executed. Many would have broken, but not Shiratori. He observed the guards every day, watching for their mistakes. After months, he found a 15-minute gap in their patrol. At 5:30 a.m., Shiratori made his move. He reached under his thin bedding and pulled out a metal wire he had smuggled in from the prison bathhouse, where it was originally part of a bucket support ring. His hands shook from the cold as he picked the lock. Click! The cell door opened. He took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. But there were more doors ahead, each locked tight. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked quickly. The thought of getting caught made his heart pound. Finally, the last door opened, and he stepped outside. For a moment, Shiratori felt the night air on his face. But freedom was still far away. The prison was surrounded by a vast search perimeter, patrolled by guards who would be on high alert once his absence was discovered. If he wanted to truly escape, he needed to get far enough that they couldn't catch up. The real challenge had only just begun. At 5:45 a.m., the guards returned to his cell. One guard peeked inside. "He's asleep," he said. But what they didn't realize was that the sleeping man was a pile of loose floorboards under the blanket. Shiratori had tricked them again. By morning, the guards discovered the truth. The alarm was raised, and the search began. But by then, Shiratori was gone. 3 days later, hunger drove him to steal from a hospital. The police caught him. This time, they locked him up for life. You might think Shiratori would lose hope, but if you know anything about him, you know this was just the beginning. After 6 years, in 1942, Shiratori was sent to Akita prison. This place was even worse than Aomori. The guards there hated him. "You're the escape artist," they sneered. "We'll make sure you never try that again." Every day, the guards beat him until he could barely stand. They made him work in freezing temperatures, moving heavy stones with bare hands. At night, they locked him in a cell with no blankets, forcing him to sleep on the icy concrete. Shiratori knew that if he stayed in Akita prison, he wouldn't last. The abuse, the cold, and the starvation would eventually kill him. He had a wife and a daughter who believed in him. He had to survive for them. "I have no choice," he thought. "If I want to live, if I want to see my family again, I must escape." Stormy night, the guards came to check Shiratori's cell. What they found left them speechless. The cell was empty. His cuffs lay on the ground and the prisoner was gone. Shiratori's escape wasn't luck. It was brilliance. To understand his plan, you have to understand his cell. The room was small and dark, with copper walls so smooth they were impossible to grip. The ceiling was high, with a tiny skylight that barely let in any light. The guards thought no one could escape from such a place. But Shiratori saw an opportunity. The copper walls, though smooth, were also sturdy. He realized he could use them for support. By pressing his hands and feet against opposite walls, he could inch his way upward like a lizard. At the top, the skylight was sealed, but the wooden frame holding it was starting to rot. Every night, Shiratori climbed up and loosened it a little, careful not to make any noise. Meanwhile, he had smuggled a small wire from the prison yard. He used it to pick his handcuffs. Each time he climbed the walls, he freed himself from the cuffs. but he always put them back on before morning to avoid suspicion. For 2 months, Shiratori repeated this routine. Then, on a stormy night, when the thunder roared and rain battered the roof, he made his move. He climbed the walls one final time, pushed the skylight free, and squeezed through the opening. The rain muffled his movements, and the thunder masked any sounds he made. When the guards finally noticed, it was too late. Shiratori was already far away, running into the stormy night. 3 months after his escape from Akita prison, in autumn 1942, Shiratori found himself in desperate need of help. Hiding in the forests and mountains had left him exhausted and weak. But there was one person he believed might listen: Kobayashi, the head guard at Akita prison. Kobayashi was unlike the others. He never beat Shiratori. Instead, he showed small acts of kindness, checking on Shiratori's well-being when others ignored him. Shiratori thought, if there's anyone I can trust, it's him. One evening, he stood shivering outside Kobayashi's door. Gathering what little strength he had left, he knocked. When Kobayashi opened the door, his eyes widened in shock. Standing before him was Shiratori. His clothes were torn, and his face was gaunt, but his determination was still there. "I need your help," Shiratori said. Kobayashi invited him inside and gave him food. Shiratori explained why he escaped: the brutal abuse, the freezing conditions, and the desperate need to see his family again. But while Shiratori rested, Kobayashi called the police. When the officers arrived, Shiratori didn't fight back. He simply said, "I thought I could trust you." In 1943, Shiratori was sent to Abashiri prison, the harshest and coldest prison in Japan. No one had ever escaped from it, and the guards were determined to keep that record. They locked Shiratori in a special cell designed just for him. It had thick steel bars, smooth walls, and reinforced doors. His handcuffs and leg cuffs weighed 20 kilograms and had no keyholes, so they couldn't be picked. Even his food portions were cut in half, leaving him weak and hungry. But Shiratori was not an ordinary man. He didn't see this cell as a cage. He saw it as a puzzle. Every day, as the guards slid his food through the opening, he began to plan. First, he used the miso soup they gave him. He poured it over the iron bolts on the floor, letting the salt slowly corrode the metal. Night after night, he repeated this, watching as the screws rusted and weakened. Second, he turned his food bowl into a tool. Using its edge, he carefully loosened the bolts holding the floorboards in place. It was slow, grueling work, but Shiratori was patient. By spring, he had loosened the bolts enough to lift the floorboards. But there was a problem. The hole was too small for his body to fit through. Most men would have stopped there. Not Shiratori. He had one more trick. Shiratori could dislocate his shoulders at will. With this painful skill, he squeezed through the narrow opening like a snake, pulling himself into the freezing earth below. Once outside the cell, the real challenge began. The guards believed the snow-covered mountains surrounding the prison were impossible to cross. But Shiratori had spent months observing the guards and studying the layout of the prison. He knew exactly where to go. As he climbed the Rhine through the snow, the freezing wind cut into his skin. But he pushed on, his body numb and his mind focused on one goal: freedom. When the guards discovered the empty cell, they couldn't believe their eyes. His cuffs lay neatly on the floor. The bolts had been removed without a sound, and the prisoner they thought could never escape was gone. Once again, Shiratori had achieved the impossible. After escaping from Abashiri prison, Shiratori fled into the snowy mountains of Hokkaido. He found an abandoned mine and turned it into his home. For 2 years, he lived alone, surviving on wild rabbits, berries, and crabs he caught in streams. To survive, he even studied the habits of bears, learning their techniques for hunting and gathering food. Life was harsh, but Shiratori endured, yet isolation was not sustainable. His clothes were worn to rags, and the winters were brutally cold. Hunger gnawed at him every day. "I need real food," he thought. So he decided to take a risk and head down to a nearby village. One evening in summer 1945, he passed a tomato field. Starving, he plucked a ripe tomato, hoping no one would notice. But a farmer appeared and mistook him for a thief who had been stealing from the village. A scuffle broke out. The farmer, in panic, pulled a knife. Shiratori grabbed it to defend himself. In the chaos, the blade pierced the farmer's abdomen. The man fell to the ground, bleeding. Shiratori knelt beside him, horrified. "It was an accident," he whispered. But the farmer didn't survive. When the police arrived, Shiratori didn't run. He stayed by the body, knowing there was no way to explain what had happened. He was arrested and sentenced to death for murder. Despite his claims of self-defense, they sent him to Sapporo prison, where he awaited execution. The last escaped Sapporo prison was different. Shiratori was placed in a death row cell designed specifically for him. Steel bars thicker than his arm, every opening smaller than his head, and even the floor reinforced with heavy bolts. 6 armed guards monitored him day and night, rotating in shifts to ensure he had no chance of escape. "This time, there's no way," they said. At first, the guards watched him like hawks. They inspected his cell with precision, searching for tools, loose bolts, anything he might use. But weeks passed, and something changed. A man who gave up? Shiratori lay on his thin mattress for hours every day. When the guards barked orders, he barely moved. He didn't eat much of the cold rice and miso soup they slid under the door. At night, he stayed curled under his blanket, silent and still. "He's broken," one guard said. "You can see it in his eyes. The cold's getting to him. He's finally accepted his fate." Their confidence grew. Inspections became less thorough. Conversations during shifts turned casual. "What's the point?" they reasoned. "He's just waiting to die now." Their inspections became quicker and lazier. Instead of checking the bolts or corners of the cell, they would simply glance at him under the blanket and leave. But one morning, something felt off. The guard on duty called to Shiratori through the bars. "Hey, get up!" he barked. No response. He banged on the door. "I said get up!" When Shiratori didn't move, the guards unlocked the cell, preparing to drag his lifeless body to its feet. But when they pulled back the blanket, their blood ran cold. The bed was empty. Instead of a man, they found a pile of neatly folded prison garments. Beneath them, the bolts securing the floorboards were missing, and the boards themselves were pried open to reveal a dark, narrow crawl space. "He's gone!" one guard shouted, his voice trembling. The others stared in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had happened. What the guards didn't know was that Shiratori had never given up hope. Every motionless hour spent under the blanket had been part of his plan. Shiratori had noticed the bolts on the floorboards were rusted from years of dampness. While the guards believed the cell was unbreakable, he saw an opportunity. Each night, as the guards patrolled outside, Shiratori used the edge of his miso soup bowl to scrape at the bolts, loosening them little by little. His hands bled from the effort, but he ignored the pain. When footsteps approached, he replaced the bolts and laid perfectly still, pretending to sleep. The work was slow and grueling. It took weeks of patience and precision, but eventually, he freed enough bolts to lift the floorboards. Beneath them, he discovered a crawl space leading into the earth. Shiratori dug silently with his bare hands, scraping through dirt and mud to create a tunnel. He hid the soil beneath his blanket, careful never to leave a trace. By the time the guards had convinced themselves he was broken, the tunnel was nearly complete. After escaping from Sapporo prison, Shiratori lived as a fugitive for a year. But this time, something changed. One day, he met a kind policeman who offered him a cigarette. It was a small gesture, but it moved Shiratori deeply. All his life, he had been beaten and betrayed by officers of the law. This act of kindness broke through his defenses. Shiratori confessed his identity to the officer. He was arrested, but this time, the court showed him mercy. They reduced his sentence, acknowledging the abuse he had endured and recognizing the accidental nature of the farmer's death. This all happened in 1948. In Tokyo prison, the guards treated him with dignity. No more beatings, no more starvation. For the first time, Shiratori felt like a human being. By 1961, he was released on parole. He returned to Aomori, where he hoped to reunite with his daughter. Shiratori's story is one of resilience, intelligence, and the unbreakable will to survive. Despite the odds, he lived to see freedom again, becoming a legend in Japanese history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more fascinating tales like this one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.